It started with a knock. I remember it clearly. The way the sound echoed through the empty hall of my house, like a whisper against the walls. Software, slow. Three gentle raps, almost polite. It was 3:17 a.m. on a bitter March night. The kind where the cold doesn't just bite your skin, it coils into your bones and makes a home there. At first, I thought it was a dream. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the fireplace flickering low, half-empty whiskey glass still in my hand. But the knock came again. Not urgent, not frantic, just deliberate, as if whoever was knocking knew I was awake and was simply waiting for me to come to the door. I rose slowly, my joints stiff from the cold, the awkward angle I'd been sleeping in. The living room light was dim, casting long shadows across the floor. The front door was just down the hall, framed in a pale rectangle of moonlight that spilled through the frosted glass. I paused in front of it. "Hello?" I called. Silence. I waited another moment, then opened the door. Nothing. Just a wall of falling snow, the wind curling in with a sharp hiss. The porch was empty, but something caught my eye. Footprints. Small, bare footprints trailing across the porch and down into the yard. No shoes, no coat, just human-shaped impressions pressed deep into the snow. And then, nothing. No tracks leading to the house. Just those prints, starting right at my front door and ending several feet away like someone had simply appeared out of the air. I stepped outside for a moment, the cold stealing the breath from my lungs. I followed the prints for a few feet, but they vanished into the white blur. I shook my head, cursed under my breath, and went back inside. I locked the door behind me and told myself it must have been a prank. Kids. But I couldn't shake the image of those prints. Bare feet, so perfectly formed, so eerily still in the snow. The next night, it happened again. 3:17 a.m. Three knocks. Same rhythm, same silence when I answered. And again, footprints. In a different pattern, this circling the porch, a spiral. I didn't sleep that night. By the third night, I was waiting for it. I sat near the door, wrapped in a blanket, flashlight in hand, the baseball bat from my garage lying across my lap. When the knocks came, I threw open the door instantly, hoping to catch whoever was messing with me, but there was no one there. The footprints were already there, laid out in a perfect pattern that hadn't existed moments before, a trail that led up the steps, then disappeared. The snow that night was heavier, a quiet suffocation that blanketed everything. As I stared at the empty porch, something occurred to me. Each time the knocks came, it wasn't snowing during the moment. It would always pause for a few minutes. Stillness. Then, once I opened the door, the storm resumed, stronger than before. I started staying up later, hoping I could catch whatever it was in the act. I set up a camera outside the door, pointing toward the steps. But when I reviewed the footage the next day, all I saw was static during the exact time of the knocks. The moment passed, and the footage resumed like nothing had happened. That's when the whispering started. I'd hear it in the walls, low and muffled, always just beneath the sound of the not words at first, just noise, breathing. But then it became clear. A voice whispering my name from the vents, from beneath the floorboards. I tried sleeping during the day, tried tuning out the noises with music, with the TV on full volume. Nothing worked. I was unraveling. The house felt colder, even when the fire was roaring. Every surface felt damp. My fingers trembled constantly, and I started wearing gloves indoors. Then one night, the whispers spoke more clearly than ever. A phrase repeated again and again from behind the door. "Let me in, please. I'm so cold." I didn't open the door that night, but the knocking never stopped. It came every night, and not just at the front door anymore. Sometimes from the back entrance, sometimes from the windows, sometimes from beneath the floor. And then I started seeing her. A woman standing in the snow a few yards from the house, naked, pale, her skin the color of frost, hair matted with ice, lips blue, eyes wide and sunken. She didn't move. She never approached, just stood there, watching. I'd stared at her through the window for hours, sometimes paralyzed. I once tried to open the door, just to speak, just to ask what she wanted, but she vanished the moment I turned the handle. One night I saw her reflection in the window, but when I turned around, she was behind me, not outside, inside. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but she was gone again. Nothing there. Nothing but a puddle of half-melted snow on the floor where she'd stood. I began researching the house, desperate for it. I found a name, Graham Lentz, the original owner before me. He died here years ago. Official cause, hypothermia, but that didn't make sense. The furnace was working when they found him. The firewood was stocked. His body was curled at the front door, hands bloodied from pounding on it. They said it looked like he'd been trying to get out of the house, trying to escape something, but the door was locked from the outside. That's when I realized it wasn't someone knocking to get in. It was someone trying to keep me. I tried to leave, packed a bag, booked a hotel in town, I made it as far as the driveway before the snow started falling heavier than I'd ever seen before. My car skidded, hit a tree. I walked back soaked and shivering, fingers numb. The house welcomed me, like it always did. That night, the knocks came again. But this time, the door opened on its own, and she was standing there. I don't remember what happened after. I just remember waking up the next morning, the fire crackling, my clothes soaked through, my skin cold as ice. The front door was shut. No footprints, no sign of her. But something feels different now. The house is warmer, quieter. The knocking has stopped. I think I think she's finally inside. And now, I think I'm the one who's going to start knocking. Maybe not tonight, but soon. When March comes again, it was supposed to be a temporary escape. I'd rented a small cabin deep in the woods to get away from everything work stress, a recent breakup, the suffocating noise of the city. I needed silence, solitude, a place to breathe again. March was still clinging to winter's bitter grip, and the forest was blanketed in thick snow, branches heavy and drooping, the air sharp and still. The cabin was old, creaky, and isolated, exactly what I was looking for. The rental ad had described it as rustic with charm, but it felt more like something forgotten by time. The walls were weathered, the floorboards groaned with every step, and the fireplace looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was mine for a week, and I welcomed the quiet. On the second night, I started noticing something strange. It began with the smell, a faint sour odor in the air, like wet soil and rotting wood. I assumed it was just the old cabin scent, but it clung to everything. I opened the windows, lit scented candles, even tried scrubbing the floor with soap and bleach, but the smell always came back, thicker at night. Then, there were the noises. At first, just soft creaks, natural for a cabin settling in the cold. But soon, they became heavier, rhythmic, like footsteps. I told myself it was the wind, the trees brushing against the walls. But some nights, the sound would come from just outside the bedroom door. Slow, deliberate thuds, pausing, moving again, pausing. I never saw anyone when I checked. Just silent, just snow. By the fourth night, I hadn't slept more than a few hours. The sound of footsteps had started to echo in patterns, circling the cabin, pacing outside the windows, then stopping at the door. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing, heavy, wet breathing other side. One night, I decided to leave a chair pressed against the door, a childish precaution, but it made me feel better. I even considered driving back to town, but a snowstorm rolled in just as I was about to leave, one of the worst I'd ever seen. The trees bent under the weight of the wind, snow piled up in feet within hours, and the road back was swallowed by white. I was trapped. The storm knocked out the power that no heat, no lights. I wrapped myself in every blanket I could find and lit a few candles. The shadows in the room grew long, flickering against the wooden walls. That's when I saw it, a figure, just beyond the window, motionless. It was barely visible through the snow and the warped glass, but it was there, a tall, pale figure standing in the woods, maybe 30 feet away. I stared at it for minutes, frozen. It didn't move. I looked away to grab my flashlight. When I looked back, it was gone. I searched outside in the morning, found nothing but deep footprints in the snow, bare feet again. That night, something changed. The figure came closer. I saw it again, this time just outside the porch, its face obscured by long, wet hair, body pale and thin, arms hanging unnaturally low. It didn't move, just stood there, watching, waiting. I locked every door and window, barricaded myself in the bedroom, even though the locks felt useless, something like. I stayed up the entire night, clutching a fire poker, shaking with fear. At 3:17 a.m., I heard scratching on the door. Not knocking, scratching, fingernails dragging across the wood. A slow, scraping sound that made my teeth ache. Then a voice, whispered, soft, almost a lullaby. I used to live here. This was my home. I froze. The voice was hollow, childlike, and it was coming from inside the cabin. I turned slowly toward the hallway. The scratching was now coming from the bedroom closet. I didn't move for hours. I sat there, gripping the poker, eyes fixed on that closet door. The scratching stopped just before sunrise. When I finally opened the closet, there was nothing, but in the corner of the floor was a small, wet handprint. I left that morning. The storm had calmed enough for me to take the car and push through the icy road. I didn't look back. I didn't care about my things. I just needed to leave that place. A few days later, I contacted the property owner. I asked him if anyone had ever reported anything strange. He paused for a long time, then he said, "That cabin, it used to belong to my sister. She disappeared there one winter. They never found her body. The police thought she ran off, but she used to say she heard things in the walls, saw something in the trees, said the house remembered things." I didn't respond. I didn't ask for a refund. I didn't want to know anything else. but I still smell that in my apartment, in my car. And some nights I wake up to the sound of slow, wet footsteps pacing outside my bedroom, and I wonder if something followed me back. It was my first winter as a night security guard at the old Ravenshade Mill. The place was a relic, an abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of town that had been shut down since the late 80s. The town had plans to renovate it into a museum, but for now it was just an empty, crumbling building surrounded by forest and snow-covered silence. My job was simple: walk the perimeter a few times a night, check the motion sensors, log the rounds, and stay awake until 6 a.m. Easy money. It was cold, bitterly cold, the kind of cold that makes the air feel thick, like it's trying to drown you with every breath. But the solitude suited me. I liked the quiet, the stillness. That was until the third night. That was when the mill began to feel wrong. The building had 4 levels, 2 above ground, 1 basement, and a sub-basement locked behind a thick steel door I was instructed not to access. The main floors were mostly empty, just decaying equipment and empty shelves, except for a few old mannequins left behind from a long defunct uniform line. Most of them were broken, limbs missing, paint peeling, heads cracked. But one of them stood out. It was in the northern wing, propped in the middle of an old conveyor belt, fully intact, its pale white face turned toward the hallway. I remember noting it on my first night, nothing unusual, just another prop left behind. But on the third night, it had moved. It was now facing the opposite direction, closer to the stairwell. I thought I was mistaken. Maybe I'd misremembered its position. I shrugged it off and continued my rounds. But later that night, when I passed through the same corridor again, it had moved again, just a few feet closer to the doorway, still facing away, head tilted slightly to the side. That's when the power flickered. The lights above buzzed, dimmed, then returned. But the air felt different, heavier, like something had entered the building with me. I radioed it in, got no response. The static on the line was louder than you, like wind blowing directly into the mic. I made a note in the logbook and finished my shift, but I couldn't stop thinking about that mannequin. The next night, I checked the security footage. Nothing. Just static between 2:43 a.m. and 3:17 a.m. Every camera, every hallway. Then it all returned like nothing happened. But the logbook confirmed I'd walked that route during that exact blackout window, and the mannequin had moved again. It was now halfway down the hall, turned slightly toward the staircase. Its head was tilted down, like it was looking directly at the ground. I decided to move it. I dragged it to the equipment storage room on the second floor and locked the door behind me. I even wedged a mop handle through the handle to keep it shut tight. But by 3 a.m., the door was wide open, and the mannequin was back in the hallway. Not just back, but closer, its hands now slightly raised, as if mid-movement. The air around it was freezing cold, colder than the rest of the already freezing building. Something was wrong with this. That night, I heard footsteps in the corridor, slow, dragging steps that echoed through the empty structure. I tried to follow the sound, but it always stayed one step ahead. When I turned corners, nothing was there, but the footsteps never stopped until I reached the northern wing again. There, the mannequin stood, now just outside the stairwell door, closer than ever. Its head fully turned toward me. Its face had changed. The features were more detailed. The hollow plastic eyes now had faint outlines of irises. The mouth, slightly open, seemed to curl into a faint, sinister smile. I backed away slowly and didn't finish my rounds that night. I called off the next day, told the site manager I had food poisoning. But when I returned, something even worse awaited. There were now 2 mannequins, identical, both standing in the same hallway, one near the stairs, one near the elevator. I was certain there had only been one intact mannequin when I arrived the first day. I checked my initial log notes to confirm it. I tried to keep calm, rationalize it. Maybe someone moved another one from the storage pile. Maybe it was a prank from the renovation crew. But then I noticed something even stranger. The second mannequin looked like me. Same height, same body type, same posture, even the same uniform jacket, worn and faded, identical to mine. I checked it up close, my heart pounding, and it was my jacket. My name tag was stitched on it. I didn't know what to do. I tried to call the manager again, but the phone lines were dead. My cell had no signal, and the weather had gotten worse. Snow piled high outside, thick sheets of white pressing against the windows, like fingers trying to squeeze inside. That night, I heard laughter. Not a child's laugh, not a joyful laugh. It was low, breathy, cracked and broken, echoing through the ventilation system like it was being dragged from a throat that hadn't spoken in years. I searched every room. I found nothing but shadows. But when I returned to the security office, the mannequins were gone, and in their place, leaning against my chair, was a new man. This one was smaller, a child. Its face was missing, no eyes, no mouth, just a blank, smooth surface. but in its small hand, it held a flashlight. My flashlight, the one I'd dropped earlier during my rounds. I left that night. I didn't clock out. I didn't log anything. I ran. The snow was thick, the wind biting, but I ran until I reached my car. When I turned the ignition, the headlights caught something in the rearview mirror. Another mannequin, standing at the mill entrance, watching. I drove away without looking back. Weeks later, I tried to tell someone. The manager said I was burnt out, offered me some time off. I never went back, but I still see them sometimes. In alleyways, at bus stops, behind shop windows. Mannequins that look just like people I know. Mannequins that weren't there before. And sometimes, when I look away for just a second, they're a little closer. It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones and stayed there. March had dragged in another snowstorm, and I was house sitting for a friend who had gone out of town for a business trip. The house was in a remote area just outside a small mountain town, an old two-story structure nestled at the edge of dense woods, surrounded by fields buried under thick white snow. My friend had warned me about how quiet it got out there. He said the silence could mess with your head if you weren't used to it. I wasn't worried. I liked the quiet. At first it was peaceful. I spent the days reading, catching up on writing, watching the snow fall outside the tall living room windows. The nights were colder, but I kept the fireplace going and buried myself under thick blankets. The only sound was the wind howling across the fields and trees creaking under the weight of snow. But then, on the fourth night, things changed. I woke around 2:30 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't the wind. It was a tapping. Soft, slow, deliberate tapping on the front window. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, unsure if I was dreaming. The tapping came again. 3 soft taps. A pause, then 2 more. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The window by the front door had sheer curtains, but I could see the faint outline of something beyond it. Something tall, something motionless. I didn't move. I watched the shadow stand there for several minutes, unmoving. Then, it slowly turned and disappeared from view. I waited until morning before I opened the door. There were no footprints in the snow. None. Not a single mark near the window. Not even mine from the day before. It was as if the snow had reset itself overnight. Clean, untouched. That day, I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a branch. Maybe I was just half dreaming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That night, I locked every window, bolted the doors, and turned all the lights on. I sat in the living room with the TV on low volume, trying to keep my nerves in check. At 2:36 a.m., the power went out. Everything, lights, TV, heater, all went dark, and I sat in pitch black, the only sound the wind outside and my own shaky breathing. I reached for my phone to use the flashlight, but it was dead. I was sure I'd left it charging. Then the tapping came again, this time from the window behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I just sat there, my whole body trembling. The tapping grew louder, more aggressive. Then it stopped, and I heard something far worse, the sound of the front door handle turning, slowly, quietly. I ran to the fireplace and grabbed the metal poker, my only weapon. I waited, listening. The handle stopped. Silence returned. I backed into the hallway, heart in my throat, and made my way upstairs. That's when I noticed the guest bedroom door was open. I was certain I'd closed it earlier. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the house. Frost had gathered on the inside of the window, even though it was sealed. But what made my stomach drop was the mirror on the far wall. There were words etched into it, not written, not drawn, etched as if scraped in with something sharp. "You let me in!" I stared at those words for a long time, unable to move. Then I saw it. In the reflection, standing just beyond the hallway behind me, was a figure, pale, thin, its face entirely obscured by long, matted hair. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The mirror was now blank. No scratches, no message, no sign of anything. I slept in the bathroom that night with the door locked and a towel shoved under the crack. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care if my friend wasn't back yet. I was leaving. But when I tried to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. Dead battery. I popped the hood and saw the cables had been cut. Clean, precise slices. Not chewed, not corroded. Cut. That's when I saw the footprints, leading from the back door to the woods. Bare footprints. They weren't there yesterday. They hadn't been there this morning. But they were fresh now, standing stark in the snow. Each step pressed down deep as if whatever made them was heavy. And they weren't leaving. They were approaching. I ran back inside, slammed the door shut, locked everything. I called the nearest tow company, and while I waited, I sat in the living room, staring out the window, trying not to blink. And then it appeared again. Not walking, just standing, halfway across the field, motionless, watching. I didn't take my eyes off it, not even for a second. But with every blink, it seemed a little closer, a little taller, a little clearer. The tow truck arrived 2 hours later. When the driver knocked on the door, I nearly screamed. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was just tired. I didn't mention anything. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen, but I knew something had come to that house during the storm. Something old, something cold, something that didn't leave footprints unless it wanted to, and something that didn't need to break in because I had already let it inside. It was the coldest March I could remember, and I was stuck dog-sitting for my aunt in a house I never liked. She lived deep in the woods, in a house that looked more like a hunting lodge than a home. Wooden walls, narrow hallways, and a towering stone chimney that groaned when the wind blew hard enough. The house had a way of making you feel small, like it had been there long before you and would still be standing long after you were gone. It creaked constantly, the wooden beams groaning in the silence, like something old was shifting inside the walls. My aunt had left a day before the storm rolled in, and I was supposed to stay until she got back from her weekend trip. She had one dog, Bentley, an aging golden retriever who barely moved from his bed in the living room. He was quiet, good company, but even Bentley started acting strange the second night I was there. He wouldn't go near the hallway that led to the back door. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just getting old, sore legs, stiff joints. But when I tried to coax him down that hallway to take him outside, he whimpered and backed away, eyes wide, ears pinned flat against his head. I didn't force him. Instead, I took him out through the front door, but something about the way he stared at that hallway when we came back in made my skin crawl, like he knew something I didn't want to know. The next night, the lights flickered. The wind was howling outside, and I figured it was just the storm messing with the power line. I grabbed a flashlight just in case and sat in the living room beside the fireplace. Bentley lay next to me, his head resting on his paws, eyes fixed on the dark hallway again. That was when I heard it. A scratching sound, slow, rhythmic, like nails on wood. It came from the back door. I held my breath and listened. Bentley stood up, stiff-legged and growling, a deep, low sound I'd never heard from him. The hair on his back stood up as he stared toward the hallway. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then it stopped, silent. I got up, flashlight in hand, and walked to the end of the hallway. The back door was locked, the deadbolt secure. I checked it twice. There was nothing outside, just thick snow and pitch-black trees swaying in the wind. But when I turned around to head back, I noticed something on the floor. Scratch mark, deep grooves etched into the wooden floor just beneath the door. Long, thin marks, like clawed fingers, had scraped across the surface, trying to get in. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Bentley. He sat in front of the fireplace the whole time, growling softly whenever a floorboard creaked or the wind changed direction. The next day, I called my aunt and asked her if she'd ever had issues with animals trying to get in. Her voice went quiet. "Don't open the back door," she said. That was all she said before the call dropped. I tried calling her again, but the signal was gone, just static and silence. That night, the house felt different, colder, heavier, like something was pressing in from the outside. The windows fogged up, even though the heat was on full blast. Bentley paced nonstop, refusing to leave my side. The scratching returned just after midnight, this time louder, more aggressive, like something was desperate. But when I checked the hallway, the sound stopped. The scratch marks were deeper now, longer, spreading across the floor, like cracks in a sheet of ice. And now there was something else in the shape, a handprint, smudged into the frost-covered glass of the back door. Not a normal hand, too large, too thin, fingers longer than they should have been, like they'd been stretched, warped. I backed away, locked the hallway door, and dragged a chair in front of it. It didn't matter. At 3:17 a.m., the smoke alarm in the kitchen went off. I rushed in, heart racing, expecting a fire. But there was none. Just thick black smoke pouring from the fireplace. Bentley was gone. I searched the entire house, shouting his name, but he was nowhere to be found. No paw prints outside, no open doors or windows, just a trail of scratch marks leading to the hallway door. Inside the house now. I was losing my mind. I grabbed my coat and tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it stayed locked, like something had frozen it shut from the inside. The lights flickered again, and when they returned, the scratching started again. Not from the hallway this time, from the ceiling. I looked up and saw something moving, slowly crawling across the wooden beams, pressing down the boards with every motion. I couldn't see it clearly, just the outline. Long limbs, pale skin, a body that moved like it had too many joints in the wrong places. I ran to the basement and locked myself in. For hours, I sat in the dark, listening to it move through the house. It never made a sound, not even footstep, just that terrible scraping and the occasional groan of floorboards, giving under its weight. I thought I heard Bentley whimper once, but it sounded wrong, like someone mimicking a dog's cry, like it was trying to trick me. By morning, the sound stopped. The house was quiet again. I climbed upstairs, slow and trembling. Everything looked untouched, no marks, no scratches, no broken locks. but the back door was wide open, and in the snow outside were prints, deep, narrow, dragging footprints, leading from the doorway into the woods. I followed them. At the edge of the trees, I found Bentley's collar, and next to it, a set of claw marks carved deep into the tree bark, too high up for any normal animal. My aunt never explained what lived out there. When she returned, she didn't ask what happened. She just looked at me, pale and silent, and said, "It always finds a way in during the cold one." I never went back, but every March, I hear that scratching again, faint, distant, echoing through my walls, and I know it remembers me. It started with a phone call at midnight. I was already in bed, buried beneath thick blankets as the March wind howled outside my apartment windows. The screen lit up with an unknown number, and I almost ignored it. Almost. But something in me, some anxious whisper in the back of my mind, told me to answer. When I picked up, there was silence at first, just soft static. Then, a voice, raspy, slow, like someone struggling to speak through a mouthful of ice. "Don't go near the mirror." Click. I stared at the screen. No number. No trace of the call in my log. It was just gone. I didn't sleep after that. I couldn't. Every sound in my apartment suddenly felt amplified. Pipes creaking, the refrigerator humming, even the distant thud of footsteps from the upstairs neighbor. I kept staring at the mirror across from my bed, the one hanging over my dresser. Nothing unusual, but I couldn't stop looking at it. That sentence echoed in my mind over and "Don't go near the mirror." By morning, I convinced myself it had been a prank, maybe a wrong number or someone messing around. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Things started changing at that call. Subtle things. My reflection would lag for a split second, just a fraction of a moment, but enough to notice. I'd turn my head, and the reflection followed just a little too late. I thought maybe I was overtired and stressed, imagining things. But then it got worse. On the third night, I caught my reflection smiling when I wasn't. I froze, staring at it. My face was blank, but the reflection's mouth slowly curled upward, lips stretching just a bit too wide, eyes unblinking. I stumbled back from the mirror, my heart pounding, and as I did, the reflection snapped back to normal. My blank face stared back at me just as it should have. I didn't sleep that night either. I started covering the mirror with a sheet after that. It helped a little, at least psychologically, but that didn't stop the dream. Every night I dreamed I was standing in front of the mirror, unable to move. My reflection would stare at me, slowly tilting its head as though studying me. Then it would reach out, not toward me, but toward itself, pressing its palms against the inside of the glass like it was trapped behind it. And then, always the same thing, it would begin to mouth something. At first, I couldn't understand the words, but after several nights, I started to make them out. "Let me out." I tried to tell myself it was stress. Maybe I was finally cracking under the pressure of work, life, loneliness. But the fear didn't feel imaginary. It was thick, heavy, crawling under my skin like something alive. Then, the mirror started to make sounds, faint, barely audible tapping, like fingernails on glass. I'd hear it at night, coming from beneath the sheet. At first, it was just once or twice. Then it became rhythmic. Tap, 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 like a pattern, a code, or a message. I considered throwing it out, but something held me back. I don't even know why. It's like part of me was afraid to remove it, like I'd somehow be letting whatever was inside loose if I broke the connection. On the sixth night, everything changed. I woke up to find the sheet on the floor and the mirror uncovered, and there was something behind the reflection, not another version of it, but something tall, thin, black-eyed, with limbs that bent the wrong way. It stood behind my reflected self, watching. I spun around in real life, nothing, but in the mirror, it remained. Closer now. I screamed, grabbed my phone to take a picture, but the reflection in the photo was normal. No figure, no distortion, just me. I didn't go to work the next day. I couldn't leave my apartment. I sat in the living room, staring at the covered mirror, shaking every time the tapping began. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to the worst sound I'd ever heard, shattering glass. I ran to my bedroom and saw the mirror smashed into pieces on the floor. Shards of glass spread across the carpet, glittering like frost under me, but there was no sign of a break-in. Nothing else was disturbed. Just the mirror, just that one object, destroyed from the inside. And in the center of the largest shard was a print, not a fingerprint, a handprint, long-fingered, stretched beyond natural length, imprinted from the reverse side of the glass, as if something had pushed its way out. I packed a bag that night and left my apartment. I never went back. I changed cities, changed jobs, told myself it was over. But last week I checked into a hotel on a business trip. A normal room, clean, quiet. But as I was brushing my teeth, I looked into the bathroom mirror and saw it again, standing behind me, closer than before, smiling. It was a bitter March evening when I decided to drive out to my father's old cabin. deep in the forested hills about 2 hours from town. I hadn't been there in years, not since he died. The place had always given me an uneasy feeling, even when I was a kid. The silence out there was different, not peaceful, not serene, just vacant, like the trees were holding their breath, waiting for. But I needed time alone. Work had been unbearable. My relationship was falling apart, and my thoughts were darker than you. The cabin was remote, quiet, and empty, just what I needed. The snow had started to fall when I pulled up the old gravel road. The woods surrounding the place were dense and shadowy. Tree limbs bowed under the weight of thick snow. The cabin looked the same. Aged timber, moss clinging to the walls, shutters slightly crooked. The windows were iced over, but the chimney was still intact, and there was a stack of firewood under the porch awning. I unloaded my things and stepped inside. The cold hit me like a wall. It took nearly an hour for the fire to warm the place, enough to remove my jacket. The inside was exactly as my father had left it. Old furniture, dusty shelves, and the same stained rug I remembered from childhood. But something about it all felt off, like it had been disturbed recently. That night, I kept hearing noises from the woods. Strange ones, not animals, not branches snapping. It sounded like whispering, low, almost rhythmic, like someone speaking through clenched teeth from a distance. I told myself it was just the wind and tried to sleep. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to a loud thud. Something had hit the side of the cabin, hard. I bolted upright, listening. The fire had died down to embers, and the shadows seemed to thicken around the walls. Another thud came, this time from the back wall, then silence, then 3 sharp knocks against the front door. I didn't move. I just sat there in my bed, the blanket pulled to my chin, barely breathing. The knocks didn't come again. I eventually passed out from sheer exhaustion, though I don't remember falling asleep. The next morning, I found something in the snow outside. Tracks, but not like boot prints or animal prints. These were long, narrow indentations, dragging as though something was slithering or crawling through the snow. They led from the tree line straight to the cabin, and then vanished. There were no return tracks. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, lights on, a flashlight in one hand and a hatchet in the other. I thought maybe I was losing it. Maybe the isolation was making me paranoid. But around 2:30 a.m., I saw something through the window. It was standing at the edge of the woods, not moving, not approaching, just watching. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, its arms hanging far too low, nearly to its knees. I couldn't make out its face, just the silhouette against the white snow. I stared at it for over an hour, and it never moved. Then the lights flickered and went out. The fire dimmed all at once, as though something had sucked the heat from the air. My breath clouded in front of me. I scrambled to relight the fire, my hands shaking, but the matches wouldn't spark. My flashlight flickered once and died. In the silence, I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. But they weren't heavy. They were dragging, slow, scraping movements, like something pulling itself along. Then came the breathing, wet, raspy breathing, just beyond the wall. I backed into the far corner of the room, heart slamming in my chest, holding the hatchet like it was going to save me. And then the doorknob began to turn, slowly, carefully, testing. But it didn't open. Instead, something began tapping on the window behind me. I spun around, nothing there, just frost. But something was now written in the condensation on the glass. Words smeared in long, bony finger streaks. Welcome home. I ran upstairs, barricaded the door, and stayed awake until daylight. When the sun finally rose, everything was still, silent, no footprints, no marks, nothing. Just a thick layer of frost on the inside of every window, except the one with the message, which was clean now, as if it had never happened. I packed my things and left that morning. I didn't even lock the door. I just got in my car and drove, hands shaking the entire way home. But a few nights later, back in my apartment, I found something on my bathroom mirror, a single, long, foggy fingerprint, smudged across the glass. I live alone. No one else had been there. And now every night, I hear faint scratching at my window, even though I live on the 3rd floor. Something followed me from that cabin. Something old, something that didn't need a door to get in. And sometimes, when I try to sleep, I hear it whispering from the shadows. You were never. It was a cold March evening when my sister called, her voice trembling. She rarely called me. Our relationship had grown distant over the years. But that night, something in her tone made my blood run cold before she even finished her sentence. I need you to come to Mom's house. There's something wrong with it. Our childhood home sat in a secluded area on the edge of a quiet town, abandoned since Mom passed away 3 years ago. Neither of us had been back since the funeral. We couldn't bear it. The memories, the stillness, the feeling that the house was somehow still holding its breath, waiting for her return. But something in my sister's voice left no room for question. I packed a bag, got in my car, and started the 2-hour drive through increasingly heavy snowfall. The road seemed darker than usual, the forest looming closer to the highway, swallowing any stray light from the moon. When I arrived, I noticed it immediately. The air around the house felt heavier. The porch lights were off, but something faint flickered in the upstairs window, like candlelight, though no one had lived here in years. My sister met me at the door, pale and hollow-eyed. "There's something inside," she whispered before I could even speak. "It doesn't feel like a house any." The moment I stepped through the threshold, I understood. The temperature dropped several degrees. The air was thick with rot and something sweeter, decay mixed with something floral. The furniture was all covered in white sheets, but they were stained with blotchy, dark spots, like something had seeped through them. Then came the smell, an overwhelming, suffocating scent of wet earth and mildew, as if the walls themselves were rotting from within. "I've been hearing her voice," my sister said. "Mom's voice, calling me from the basement." I froze. "She never even went into the," I said, my voice trembling. "She was terrified." "I know. That's what makes it worse." That night we stayed in the living room, too afraid to sleep in our old bedroom. Every few hours, something would thump beneath the floorboard. Once, around 3 a.m., the basement door slowly creaked open on its own. Neither of us moved to close it. The next morning, I tried to leave. I needed to get out, even just to get some air and think clearly. But when I stepped outside, the car wouldn't start. The snow had thickened overnight, burying the driveway. My phone had no signal, no matter where I stood. It was like the house didn't want me to leave. Later that day, we found something in the hallway. On the wall, just beneath one of Mom's old framed photos, a word had been scrawled into the plaster with something sharp. "Stay." We stared at it for a long time, neither of us speaking. That evening, I agreed to go into the basement with her. I don't know why. I think part of me hoped it would end whatever was happening, that we'd find a logical explanation. Rats, a draft, something real. But the moment we descended those stairs, I knew there would be no such comfort. The basement was colder than any winter night, the air so thick it hurt to breathe, and then the lights, bare hanging bulbs overhead, began to flicker. Something moved in the corner behind the old shelves, where we used to store holiday decoration, old furniture. We heard footsteps, not ours, something soft and dragging, like bare feet sliding slowly across the concrete floor. Then we heard it, her voice. But it wasn't our mother's voice. Not really, it sounded like her. Soft, melodic, but wrong. Twisted, like someone mimicking her speech patterns, but missing the soul behind them. "Come down, girls, I've been waiting." My sister started crying. I grabbed her hand and backed away. But something moved out from behind the shelf. I swear it looked like our mother. Same nightgown, same gentle face, but her eyes were empty, black voids. Her mouth was stretched wider than a human mouth. She stepped toward us, arms outstretched, and then we both screamed and ran back up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut. The next few days were a blur. We tried everything, cleansing rituals, burning sage, even contacting a priest. But whatever was in that house wasn't interested in leaving. It wanted us to stay. Every night, the voice would get louder. The house would get colder. The shadows would shift on their own. Sometimes we'd see her, walking past the windows outside, though we never heard the door open. On the fifth night, I woke to find my sister standing at the basement door, her hand on the knob. "She's calling me," she whispered, eyes glazed over. "She says it's safe now." I pulled her away, locked the door, and forced her back into the living room. But I knew the house had already gotten into her head. That night, she disappeared. I searched the entire house, no sign of her, no footsteps in the snow, no broken doors or windows. But the basement door was open again. I haven't seen her since. I left the next morning, abandoning everything. I don't know how I made it out. I don't remember driving away. It's all a blur. But last night, I woke up in my apartment to a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. My phone rang at exactly midnight. I answered it, trembling, and I heard her voice again. "Come home. I'm still here." It was supposed to be a temporary escape, just a week away from the noise of city life. I'd rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan, a place where the snow blanketed everything in silence, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was perfect, peaceful. I wanted time to think, to breathe, to finally finish the manuscript I'd been working on for months. The cabin was rustic but comfortable. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a massive window that framed the icy wilderness like a painting. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, writing, hiking through the snowy trails, and watching snow fall in slow, mesmerizing sheets. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with a knock on the door. A single sharp knock. I was in the kitchen sipping tea when it echoed through the cabin. I froze. It was almost midnight. The snowstorm had picked up outside, No one should have been out there. No one could have been. I waited, thinking maybe it was a tree branch hitting the door. But then it came again. Louder, slower this time. One knock, then silence. I approached the door cautiously and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just snow swirling under the porch light, I opened the door a crack and scanned the porch. No footprints, no sign of anyone. Just an untouched stretch of white. I chalked it up to wind or some kind of natural sound distortion from the storm. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft tapping sounds on the window, on the walls, on the roof. Always faint, always in patterns. Not rhythmic like wind, but intentional. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow. Bare footprints, human-shaped but far too long, with toes that looked slightly clawed. They started at the tree line and ended directly beneath my bedroom window. No trail leading away. That's when I started to feel watched. The forest that once felt serene now felt suffocating, like the trees were pressing in closer with every passing hour. The shadows between them seemed to move, shift, breathe. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see something standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. By the fifth night, I was barely sleeping. I kept hearing voices, whispers carried on the wind, almost indistinguishable, but just coherent enough to make out single words, my name, over and over. I tried leaving the next morning. I packed everything into my car, but it wouldn't start. The engine clicked, then died, even though it had worked fine before. The snowplow hadn't been by in days, and the road was buried in feet of snow. I was completely cut off. I started keeping the fireplace going constantly, needing light, warmth, something to make the place feel alive. But even the fire didn't help. The shadows flickered in strange patterns, and I swore I saw movement, shapes darting across the walls that weren't mine. That night, I heard the knock again, but this time it didn't stop. It kept coming. Slow, deliberate knocks in a repeating pattern, then scratching at the door, then whispers again. Not outside, inside. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, heart racing. I held my phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal, just static and faint feedback, like a voice buried beneath the noise. And then I heard it. Laughter. Low, rasping, inhuman. When I woke the next morning, I found strange symbols carved into the doorframe. I hadn't heard anything in the night, nothing past that laughter. But the symbols were deep, jagged, etched with something sharp. I didn't recognize them, but they filled me with a deep, sickening dread. I stopped using the front door entirely. I didn't want to go near it. The whispers were louder now. I could hear them even during the day. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, except for one word that repeated over and over: exchange. It wasn't until the seventh day that I saw it. I was walking past the large window when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, and there it was, standing at the edge of the clearing. Tall, gaunt, skin stretched tight over a bony frame, its limbs too long, joints angled wrong. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. It had no face, just smooth, pale skin where eyes and mouth should have been. But I felt it staring at me. I dropped to the floor, heart pounding, afraid it had seen me, afraid it would come closer. But when I looked back again, it was gone. That night, I dreamed I was in the woods, lost, snow falling in thick sheets, something behind me, following, always just out of sight. And in the dream, I heard the word again: exchange, exchange, exchange. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know what I was supposed to give. But something had changed. I wasn't just seeing it now. I was feeling it inside me. The last night, I woke up to find all the furniture in the cabin rearranged. The chairs, the couch, even the heavy dining table, all moved into a perfect circle around the fireplace. At the center of the circle was a single object, a mirror I'd never seen before. When I looked into it, I didn't see myself. I saw the forest. I saw that thing. I saw myself standing next to it, pale, empty-eyed, smiling. I smashed the mirror, screamed until my throat went raw. I don't remember the rest of the night clearly. Just noise, screeching, shadows, cold that sunk into my bone. When I woke up, it was morning. The storm had passed. I walked outside and found footprints again, this time leading away. I followed them to the tree line, and then nothing. They just stopped. I drove home that day. The car started on the first try. The road was clear. It was as if nothing had happened, but something followed me back. I see it in my reflections, my smile lingering a moment too long, my eyes twitching in directions they shouldn't. I hear knocks at night, even in my apartment, and sometimes, when I sleep, I dream of the forest again, of the circle, of the exchange. It was just supposed to be a quick job, nothing complicated, nothing dangerous. I was hired to do some routine maintenance on a remote communication tower, nestled deep in the mountains, the kind of job no one wants to take during winter, especially in March, when the cold bites deeper and the snow never seems to stop. But I needed the money, and the pay was good, too good. The company sent me up there with a snowmobile, a generator, and a crate of supplies. I was to stay overnight in a small service outpost, located at the base of the tower. Just a small concrete structure with a bed, a heater, and the bare essentials. The place hadn't been used in months. No one had been up there since late autumn, and judging by the condition of the outpost, that was painfully obvious. The first few hours went smoothly. I ran diagnostics, swapped out some parts, rebooted systems, basic stuff. The wind howled nonstop, and the snow kept piling up around the outpost. But I was used to that. What I wasn't used to was the static interference I kept hearing through my radio. At first, I thought it was normal atmospheric noise, but then I began to hear something strange, woven into the static. A voice, not a full sentence, not words even, just a low rasping hum, like someone breathing right into the mic. I turned the radio off, thinking I was just exhausted, but later that night, I woke up to that same static sound, except now it wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the tower. The lights on the control panel were flickering erratically, and the hum had grown louder, clearer. It wasn't wind, it wasn't feedback. It was a voice, and this time, I could make out a single word repeating over and over. Below. I stood there for a long time in silence, staring out the frost-coated window toward the dark silhouette of the tower. It looked like it was leaning slightly, but I knew that couldn't be true, just a trick of the shadows. Still, something about it felt wrong, off-kilter, twisted some. I bundled up and stepped outside. The snow had stopped and everything was quiet, eerily. Not a single sound, not even from the wind. The world was muffled under a thick white blanket, but as I approached the tower, I noticed fresh tracks in the snow. They weren't mine, they were deep and heavy, like someone dragging their feet, except the gait was uneven, unnatural. One foot was longer than the other, the toes clawed into the snow. I followed the trail around the back of the tower, where I found something I wasn't prepared for, a metal hatch buried beneath ice and snow. There was no mention of it in the schematics, no indication of an underground level, but the words still echoed in my mind. Below. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I chipped away the ice and pried the hatch open. Cold air blasted from below, far colder than it should have been. I descended slowly into darkness, flashlight flickering as I went. What I found down there didn't make sense. It was a corridor, long, narrow, lined with rusted metal walls and dim emergency lights that flickered weakly. The air smelled of damp decay and something else, something sweet and rotten. I kept walking, heart pounding, unsure whether I was awake or dreaming. Then I heard footsteps, not behind me, ahead, slow, dragging. I raised my flashlight, shaking hands trying to stay steady. That's when I saw the silhouette. It stood just at the edge of the light, swaying slightly. Human-shaped, but gaunt. Elongated arms, skin pale and stretched taut over bones. I froze, breath caught in my throat. It didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching. Then it whispered, "You were chosen." I ran. I turned and sprinted back to the ladder, climbed up faster than I thought possible, slammed the hatch shut and bolted the lock. But something was. The snow outside wasn't fresh anymore. The tracks, the ones I'd followed, were gone, replaced by hundreds of others, surrounding the tower, surrounding the outpost, as if a crowd had been standing out, silently watching. I rushed back to the outpost and tried to contact base, but the radio was dead. No power, no signal, just static. And underneath it, still faint, still persistent, below, below. That night, I didn't sleep. Every few hours, I heard something moving outside, scratching at the walls, tapping at the window, something whispering in a language that felt like it was clawing into my brain. At one point, I heard the door handle rattle, and I swear something laughed on the other side. I held my breath until sunrise, but even then I didn't feel safe. The snow had buried the hatch again. The tracks were gone. And the tower? It was standing perfectly straight now. No lean, no flickering lights, like nothing had ever happened. When the company's retrieval team finally arrived, I was shaking, sleepless, and half delirious. I told them everything. They didn't believe me, of course. They said the hatch was probably a service tunnel I hadn't been briefed on, that the radio interference was just the storm, that I was exhausted, hallucinating. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I still hear it even now, weeks later. Whispers in my dreams, scratching behind the walls of my apartment, a shadow in the corner of my room, the same word repeating over and over, below. And sometimes I wake up with snow on my floor and footprints that don't belong to me. It started with a knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate taps echoing through the quiet house. I was home alone that night, the wind howling outside as March's winter cold clawed at the windows. I had no reason to expect visitors, especially not at midnight. At first I thought I imagined it, maybe a branch hitting the door in the wind. But then it happened again. 3 more knocks, slow, heavy, unmistakably intentional. I hesitated for a few moments before moving to the peephole. No one was there, just the empty porch, buried under snow, and the dim yellow light of the street lamp flickering in the stormy wind. Still, something didn't feel right. My heart was beating faster than it should have been. I tried to laugh it off and walked away, but before I could reach the kitchen, the knock came again. Only this time it was on the back door. That door was never used. I stood in the hallway, frozen. No one should have been back there, not unless they walked through the yard, through 2 feet of snow, past the locked gate. I didn't look this time. I didn't want to. Instead, I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door, telling myself it was just some bored kid playing a prank. But even as I crawled under my blanket, the feeling didn't go away. That strange, suffocating sense that something was very wrong. Then, the knocking stopped altogether, and I thought maybe it was over. But then I saw the first footprint. In the hallway carpet just outside my door, a single wet footprint, bare, human, leading toward my room. I hadn't heard anything, but there it was, clear as day, melting slowly into the fabric. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stayed in bed, clutching the blanket like a shield, praying it was all a trick of the mind. But I knew better. Something was in the house. The doorknob jiggled lightly, as if someone was gently testing it. I held my breath. I could hear soft breathing right outside. Then a voice, low and rasping, like it came from a throat unused to speaking. "Are you awake?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My body refused to respond, paralyzed by fear. It whispered, "Smell it. I wanted to scream, to run, to throw open the window and jump out, but I just stayed frozen, tears streaming down my face. The handle rattled harder, and then silence. Nothing. For hours I lay there, terrified to move, ears straining for any sound. Eventually, I must have passed out from exhaustion, because the next thing I remember is morning light bleeding through the curtains. When I opened the door, there were no footprints, nothing disturbed. The house was completely untouched, like none of it had ever happened. I almost convinced myself it was a nightmare, until I found the note taped to the inside of my front door. It was scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting, the ink smeared and frozen in places. "You locked the wrong door." That was a week ago. Since then, every night at exactly midnight, the knocking returns. First the front door, then the back. Then the soft breathing in the hallway. I tried staying with friends. It followed me. I stayed in a hotel. It knocked there too, on the 4th floor, in a room with no one next door. No one believes me. They think I'm having a breakdown, that it's all in my head. But I know better, because every night, that voice gets closer. Every night, the door handle shakes harder. And last night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door unlocking inside. I don't know how much longer I can hold on, but I think tonight's the night it finally gets in. It had been 3 years since my grandfather passed away, but I still remembered every detail of his remote cabin up in the snowy woods of northern Vermont. After a bitter breakup and a relentless string of sleepless nights, I decided to retreat there for a week, hoping the cold March air and silence would help clear my mind. It was the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Wooden walls that creaked with age, a rusted fireplace, and old oil lamps that still lined the shelves. I hadn't been there since his funeral. The moment I stepped inside, a wave of cold that was far deeper than the outdoor chill wrapped around me. The cabin was supposed to be sealed up, but something felt off. Stale air, faint traces of ash in the fireplace, and a strange metallic smell that made my stomach twist. I shrugged it off and got to work unpacking. By nightfall, I had a fire going and some old jazz records playing on the turntable, just like my grandfather used. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. It wasn't until the second night that things started feeling wrong. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy thuds crunching in the snow. I froze, heart pounding, straining to hear. There were no neighbors for miles, no roads nearby, just forest and silence. I tiptoed toward the front window and peeked through the curtain. Nothing. But when I opened the door just a crack, there were footprints, bare, human footprints, trailing away from the porch into the woods. I stood there for a moment, confused and unsettled, before locking the door and retreating back to bed. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I imagined the sound. The third night was worse. This time, I was woken by the sound of something brushing against the window pane, like fingers trailing across the glass. I sat upright in bed, goosebumps crawling over my arms. It happened again. Scrape, 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 like someone was dragging nails across the window. When I looked outside, I saw nothing but trees swaying in the wind. But the strangest thing was that all the snow beneath that window was disturbed, trampled in wide, erratic circles, like someone had been pacing beneath it for hours. On the fourth night, I decided I wouldn't sleep. I made coffee, wrapped myself in blankets, and sat by the fire, watching the. Around 3 a.m., the cabin grew unnaturally cold. The fire cracked, then sputtered, then died. I tried relighting it, but the wood wouldn't catch, and then I heard the humming. It was coming from the corner of the room, faint and low, like someone whispering an old lullaby. My skin went numb. I turned slowly, and there was someone standing in the shadows near the fireplace. Not just someone, him, my grandfather, but not as I remembered him. His face was pale and sagging, eyes black and hollow. His mouth was slightly open, jaw trembling as he hummed that eerie tune from childhood. I backed away in horror, knocking over a lamp. The crash snapped me, and when I looked again, I didn't. I tried leaving the next morning. The snowmobile didn't start. The fuel line had been severed, neatly intentional. I searched the storage shed, but the tools were gone. That night, the humming returned, louder this time, coming from inside the walls, and then I found the crawl space. I never even knew there was one, behind a panel in the floor under the rug near the fireplace. The hatch was nailed shut. Something inside me screamed not to open it, but I had to. I needed to know. I pried it open and peered down into the dark. There were bones, dozens of some animal, some clearly not. Old photographs littered the dirt, strange symbols carved into the back of each, and in the center, a small wooden box. Inside was a notebook, my grandfather's journal. But it wasn't about hunting trips or fishing. It was about ritual, sacrifices, spirits that lived beneath the snow, ancient and hungry. He had made offerings every winter, and in return, they let him live in peace. But the final entry chilled me to the core. My debt is paid, but the cabin must never stay empty. The offering must continue, or they will come for me, and for whoever follows. I slammed the box shut, heart racing. The shadows in the room began to stretch, pulsing as if they were breathing. The walls groaned, and from beneath the floor, I heard scratching. That night, I barricaded the doors, lit every lamp, and sat with a kitchen knife in my hand. Around midnight, the humming began again, only now it was joined by voices, dozens whispering my name. The door shook. Something was outside, or below. I didn't last the week. I barely made it out alive. I abandoned everything, clothes, gear, supplies, and ran through the snow on foot until I reached a ranger station nearly 15 miles away. I was half frozen and delirious when they found me. I never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that same humming in my apartment, soft, distant, as if carried on the wind. And last week, I found footprints outside my door, bare, human, leading from nowhere. I'm starting to think the debt didn't end with my grandfather. It was supposed to be a quiet winter retreat, just me, a week off work, and a cozy Airbnb in a small mountain town tucked away in the cold hills of northern Montana. The listing promised snowy landscapes, isolation, and silence. That was all I wanted after months of burnout and sleepless nights. The place was quaint, an old two-story wooden house with crooked steps, a creaky porch, and a view of a frozen lake behind it. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm. Rustic, peaceful. I arrived on a cold March evening just before sunset. The trees surrounding the property were coated in thick snow, and the entire house was dimly lit by an old porch light that flickered slightly, but I didn't think much of it. The key was under the mat, just as the host had said. Inside, it was surprisingly warm, old radiators clanking gently, a faint scent of firewood, and something older, something faintly sour, like a damp cellar left closed too long. I brushed it off. It was an old house. That night, I built a fire and curled up with a book in the living room. The wind howled outside, snow falling in thick, lazy flakes. It was perfect, until I noticed the sound. Footsteps, slow, heavy, on the floor above me. I paused, heart suddenly still. I was alone in the house, had been since I arrived. I looked up toward the ceiling. The creaks continued, shifting back and forth, as if someone was pacing directly above the living room. I told myself it had to be the house settling, or a wild animal on the roof, something logical. Still, I turned off the fire and went upstairs to check. There was nothing. The upstairs was empty, just 2 bedrooms and an old bathroom. I checked every corner, even under the beds. Nothing. I went back downstairs, uneasy. That night, I dreamed of a woman standing at the top of the stairs, watching me from the shadows. Her head was tilted unnaturally, her hair soaked, eyes empty and wide. She didn't speak. She only watched. I woke up drenched in sweat, the fire in the living room completely out. In the morning, I found wet footprints on the wooden floor near the staircase, small, barefoot prints, leading from the bottom of the stairs to the kitchen and then vanishing. I cleaned them up, trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd spilled water. Maybe it was condensation from the windows. I kept telling myself, but I couldn't explain why they appeared again the next morning, this time in the hallway outside my bedroom. That night, I locked the bedroom door and kept the lamp on. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of the door handle slowly turning. It was subtle, just a faint click, followed by a soft thud against the door. Then another, and another, like someone was pressing their head against the wood. I sat frozen in bed, staring at the handle as it gently shook, and then, just barely audible, came a whisper. "Let me in." I held my breath. The whisper came again, this time from closer. just inches away. Let me in, please, I'm cold. I couldn't. I stayed like that until the whispers faded. By morning, the handle was scratched. Deep, claw-like marks dug into the metal. And more footprints. This time they led directly to the foot of my bed. I tried calling the host. No answer. I tried leaving. My rental car wouldn't start. The battery had been drained completely. The next night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, with the fire roaring, eyes fixed on the staircase. Around midnight, I saw her. She didn't walk. She glided slowly down the stairs, her soaked hair clinging to her face, skin pale and dripping wet. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her mouth moved, but no sound came. I couldn't move. I just sat there, frozen. She reached the last step and then vanished, like smoke dissolving in the air. I ran upstairs and packed. I didn't care that it was a blizzard outside. I would walk if I had to. But when I opened the front door, there was a figure standing at the edge of the trees. Not the woman, something else. Tall, thin, wearing an old, tattered coat. Its face was obscured, like it had no features at all. It didn't move, but I knew it was watching. I slammed the door and backed away. The house suddenly felt suffocating, like something inside it had woken up. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, my phone was completely dead, even though it had been charging. My laptop wouldn't power on. No signal, no power, nothing. I found a note under the front door. She never leaves once you've seen her. I ran. I didn't care about the snow, the cold, anything. I walked through the storm for hours until I reached the next cabin on the trail, some hunters staying for the week. They drove me into town. I never looked back. But now, I keep hearing her. In my apartment, in my dreams, in the dark corners of my bathroom mirror. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of water dripping on my floor and footprints that weren't there before. I don't think I left her behind. I think she followed me home. It had been over 10 years since I last visited my childhood home. After my parents passed away, the place was sold off, and life took me far away, physically and emotionally. But when I got the call that the house had gone into foreclosure, and somehow, through some tangled legal loophole, ended up back in my name, I figured I'd visit, maybe even sell it myself. It was a cold March afternoon when I returned. Snow still blanketed the front yard, though patches of dying grass peeked through. The air was bitter, and a strange heaviness sat in my chest as I stepped onto the old porch. The wind carried a scent I hadn't smelled in years. Old wood, wet leaves, and something faintly decayed. The house hadn't aged well. The siding was cracked, the windows fogged, and the front door creaked with a groan that echoed into silence as I stepped inside. Dust floated in beams of pale light, and everything felt smaller, darker, like the house had shrunk inward after all those years. But what disturbed me wasn't how old the house looked. It was that everything was exactly where I remembered it. The couch, the coffee table, even the painting of a lake we know, still hung crookedly above the fireplace. It was like time had paused in that house. That night, I stayed in my old room. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bed was still the same creaky frame I used as a kid. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories I thought I'd forgotten. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The door to my closet slowly creaked open. I sat up, suddenly alert. I hadn't opened it. I distinctly remembered it being closed. I grabbed my phone and shined the flashlight toward it. Nothing, just hanging coats and empty shelves. But the door, it hadn't opened on its own. As I settled back down, I noticed something even stranger. A new crack in the wall. A long, jagged split that hadn't been there earlier. I brushed it off. Old house, maybe some settling. But something about it looked wrong. It wasn't a crack caused by age. It looked like it had been carved. The next morning, I explored the basement. I remembered it being a place I always avoided as a kid. Dark, musty, filled with rusted tools and forgotten furniture. But as I went down the stairs, something felt different. There was a wall at the far end I didn't recognize. A section of the basement that looked newer, mismatched from the rest. When I knocked on it, it sounded hollow. I found a crowbar in the corner and pried at the edge. After a few minutes of work, a hidden door swung open. Behind it was a narrow hallway made of cold stone, something that should not have been there. I walked cautiously, flashlight trembling in my hand. The hallway descended slightly, and the walls were lined with carving. Symbols I couldn't understand, some of them familiar, only in the way nightmares are familiar. And then I found the room. A circular chamber dimly lit by shafts of light through tiny ceiling cracks. In the center was a strange stone pedestal, and around it, bones. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Some animal, some definitely not. Scrawled on the walls in dried brown stains were the same symbols from the hallway, but they were joined by phrases in English. It must not wake. Keep the sacrifice hidden. It lives in the cracks. I staggered back, nausea overtaking me. I didn't understand what I'd found. I didn't want to understand. I climbed back out and sealed the door behind me. That night, I heard scratching in the walls. It started faint, like rats, but it grew louder, stronger. I pressed my ear against the bedroom wall and heard something breathing. Then the cracks spread, not just in my room, but throughout the house. Jagged black lines forming web-like patterns on every wall. Something was moving inside them. I could see it, shadows slipping through the cracks, like tendrils of smoke trying to escape. The closet door slammed shut on its own. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight. I heard voices, whispers bleeding through the drywall, calling my name in soft, mournful tones. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. The house had closed around me, and then I saw it. It emerged from the wall, a shape, half-formed, shifting and crawling from the deepest fracture in the plaster. No eyes, no face, just an oozing mass of limbs and teeth, growing, twisting, whispering. "You brought the bloodline back," it rasped. "It was never meant to end." I ran. I don't even remember how I got out. One moment I was standing in my room, and the next I was outside, barefoot in the snow, bleeding from scratches I couldn't explain. The house loomed behind me, its windows watching like eyes. I drove away that night. I haven't gone back. I never will. But now, the cracks are in my apartment, and sometimes I hear breathing. It was a bitterly cold March evening when I arrived at the cabin. I'd booked it for a week, a remote place tucked away deep in the mountains of Vermont, far from the noise of everything. I needed time alone, not to relax, but to forget. After my sister passed in a car accident 2 months prior, everything back home reminded me of her laughter, her room, her scent still lingering in the hallways. Grief was suffocating. I thought isolation might help. The cabin sat on a steep hill surrounded by skeletal trees, their black branches slicing through the gray sky. Snow was piled high, untouched, save for the tire tracks I'd left driving up. It was the kind of silence that almost pressed in on you, a heavy stillness like the world was holding its breath. The inside was rustic but cozy. Wood-paneled walls, a fireplace, a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and large windows facing the dense woods. I settled in quickly, made some tea, and lit the fire. For a while, the quiet was comforting. I stared out the window, watching the snowflakes fall softly. The world was still, until I saw the footprints. They were faint but clear, bare footprints in the snow, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. Human footprints. And they hadn't been there when I arrived. I stepped outside, my breath curling in the air. The tracks were fresh, not yet dusted over by new snow. I followed them halfway, before they abruptly stopped a few feet from the front porch. No sign of anyone turning back, no broken branches, no footprints leading away. Just vanished, like whoever had made them had sunk into the earth or disappeared into the wind. I convinced myself it was a trick of light, or maybe old prints, exposed by a gust of wind. I went back inside and locked the door, but I didn't sleep well that night. Not with the sound of footsteps crunching snow echoing outside the bedroom window. Soft, slow drag. By morning, new footprints had, this time, circling the cabin. I didn't see anyone, not once. Just prints, getting closer, always fresh, always barefoot. I called the ranger station, but there was no signal, no internet. The landline phone in the cabin was dead. I considered leaving, but the narrow mountain road was already blanketed in thick snow and ice, too dangerous to drive back down. The second night was worse. I heard whispering outside my window. Not words, just murmurs, as though a voice were caught in a broken radio frequency. The whispering moved from one wall to another, circling the cabin like the footsteps had. And then came the tapping. Gentle knocks at the window, then louder, more deliberate. Tap, 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 as if something was trying to be invited in. I sat curled up near the fire, flashlight in hand, trying to keep myself grounded. But then, the whispering stopped, and the doorknob began to turn. I stared at it, wide-eyed. It moved slowly, twitching back and forth like fingers were fumbling with it. The deadbolt held. The knob stilled. I waited in silence for what felt like an eternity, and then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scratches down the length of the door. I didn't dare. I sat there, listening, feeling my breath stick in my throat. At dawn, I found something on the porch, something that made my blood run cold. A necklace. My sister's necklace. The same one she wore the day she died. The same one I saw in the wreckage, twisted and bloodied. But this one was clean, polished, pristine, sitting neatly in the snow like someone had placed it there for me to find. I didn't know what to believe anymore. I checked my bags, my coat, everything. Maybe it had fallen out some, but no, I hadn't brought anything of hers. I couldn't bear to. That necklace buried with. That night I heard crying, faint sobs drifting through the walls, the kind of crying that sounded familiar, too familiar. I crept to the window, heart hammering in my chest, and I saw her, standing in the snow just beyond the trees, my sister. She was barefoot, wearing her favorite coat, the one she had in the accident. Her hair matted with frost, eyes hollow, lips pale. She just stood there staring at me, weeping. I should have felt joy, relief, hope, anything but dread. But I didn't. I felt sick. Because whatever was out there, it wasn't her. I whispered her name. She tilted her head slightly, and then she began to walk toward the cabin. I backed away from the window. I locked every door, every window, stacked furniture against the entrance. The crying got louder, angrier. It turned into screams. By midnight, the cabin walls shook. The whispers returned, but now they weren't whispering. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, over and over, low and guttural, like a chorus of things buried beneath the ground. And then the lights went out. In complete darkness, I felt something enter the room. The air turned ice cold. The fire snuffed itself out. I couldn't see, but I felt the presence. Heavy, wet, cold. A breath brushed against my ear. "You left me," I screamed. When I woke up, it was morning. The cabin was quiet again. Fire still out. Everything exactly where it had been, except the walls were covered in handprints. Small, wet handprints. Hundreds of them. And the necklace was now resting on my chest, as if placed there while I slept. I left immediately. I don't care if I never see that place again. I don't care what explanation anyone offers. All I know is my sister died in a car crash, but something else is wearing her face now, and it wants me to join her in snow.